How do I do a power rankings for Stanley Cup finalists? Well, I'm about to show you. Now, of course, there's 38, not 39, because 2005 we didn't have a Stanley Cup finals. And we'll see whether or not 2020 gets added to the list. Now, when I did my power rankings of Stanley Cup champions, there was certainly some dissenting votes. I expect dissenting votes here as well. And how I ranked them is simple. I had to rank them by the strength of their opposition, and that was basically with your overall standings. I had to look at the overall team and whether or not that team would win a Stanley Cup later or whether or not that team had won a Stanley Cup before. Say, okay, so as an overall roster, was this a team that did manage to put it together or put it together before? And I had to have like a limit. So if a team had won a Stanley Cup, it had been like a decade before that. I didn't give them any specific, advantage when it comes to ranking over anybody else, because if it's a decade later, most of the players who were the core are going to be gone. So at the bottom of this list, in 38th, is the Vancouver Canucks. Now, what's interesting with this is the Vancouver Canucks, and that's the 1982 run. That's the run I love. I love that run. I think it was a great run, but they were lucky. They didn't face a team that was ahead of them in the standings until they got to the Stanley Cup Finals, where they faced the New York Islanders, who swept them. So for me, the Vancouver Canucks, a tough team, a lot of fun to watch. I really enjoy cheering for them, and it started there. But for me, I have them at the lowest spot. 37th is Philadelphia. So which Philadelphia team? Well, I'm going with 2010. I remember 2010, 10 years back, where the conversation was being had about whether or not you actually needed a number one goaltender, because Philadelphia had kind of done it without a number one goaltender. Philadelphia also had the benefit of getting to play some lower seeds. And, once they got to the Stanley Cup Finals against Chicago, there was, of course, the phantom goal that won it. And, so I have Philadelphia at 37th. These are all really good teams, so it's hard to split them out. Number 36 is the Nashville run in 2017. And honestly, again, with Nashville, they had a low ranking coming in. They did beat Chicago in the first round. They swept them. They get to the Stanley Cup Finals, and against Pittsburgh, Pekka Rinne had problems in Pittsburgh. Rinne, of course, with that incredible run in 2017 to get there. But when I was doing this on the board, and I went over it a few times, I was like, no, I have Nashville at 36th. So, yeah. And I know Nashville fans aren't going to be happy about that. At the 35th spot, I have the Minnesota North Stars, and that's the 1981 run. So, of course, in 1981, and they lost in the Stanley Cup Finals against the New York Islanders. The Minnesota North Stars were underdogs. What this did was it raised the bar. It meant that people expected a Stanley Cup in Minnesota at some point, which didn't happen. They wouldn't win a Stanley Cup until 1999 in Dallas. But still, nice little run by Minnesota. That was the first year I was watching hockey. And again, when I'm looking at the overall runs, I end up having them in 35th. 34th is Florida. So what pulls Florida down? Well, once they reached the Stanley Cup final, Colorado shoved them aside, and that was anticlimactic as a finals. And the Florida Panthers, there wasn't really a Hall of Famer there. You could make the argument for John Van Beesbrook, but other than that, it was a really good blue collar roster that I'll put their run ahead of these four, but I couldn't put it ahead of the other 33 that are above it. So there you go. Number 33, I'm just double checking years, by the way. I have it all written on a board that's over you guys can't see. I have all the numbers. I don't have that where you guys can see it, because otherwise I could just point and go, there you go. So Carolina comes in at 33rd, and that's the 2002 Stanley Cup Finals. And, it was a good run. Again, this comes down to the strength of the team, the strength of the run, all that other wonderful stuff. And then there's also with this one, just like with the Stanley Cup, I had to say to myself, okay, so objectively, the rosters, I'm looking at it, and for me, I have Carolina at 33rd, which is the only time Carolina's gone to the finals and lost. And of course, they went to the finals one other time and they won, 2006. But I have them at 33rd. 32nd is... I was worried that was going to happen. They're gonna stick together. I'm gonna pull one off, and the other ones are gonna fall over. So the 32nd is the Edmonton Oilers, and that's 2006. The Edmonton Oilers got in the playoffs. They were 14th overall. Along the way, they knocked off some pretty decent teams. Again, they're ahead of all these teams in my eyes when it comes to Stanley Cup runs. But as you guys if we get to the top row, you'll understand where my head was at with a lot of ranking Stanley Cup finalists, and why you'd see the Oilers in 32nd and all of that. But yeah, they come in 32nd for me. Good run, and of course, if Rolison doesn't get hurt in the finals, who knows? Maybe they knock off Carolina. But I thought it was kind of interesting that these two ended up next to each other. Number 31 is the Washington Capitals, and that is the 1998 run. 1998, good year. They finally broke through. They finally got into the Stanley Cup Finals, where they lost to Detroit. And again, it was kind of an anticlimactic final. It was too bad because I was really, really cheering for Washington. I had the White House, or not the White House, the Capitol building jersey, and yeah, that was a fun jersey to wear while I watched them sadly lose. It was quite the run they had, and then it came up short. Number 30, and this is a run that was 10 years later. So, the 1991 Minnesota North Stars had a poor record. They had a very poor record. So if you're looking at their overall standing, they'd be behind almost everybody else on this board. They were 16th out of 21 teams. But they beat the number 1 team in the NHL. They beat the number 2 team in the NHL. Based on the fact they beat first and second in the National Hockey League standings, I couldn't have them lower than this. So while I'm acknowledging, yes, that team, they came together at the right time, they got hot, they also knocked off the President's Trophy winner and the number 2 team overall in the first 2 rounds in order to get halfway to the Stanley Cup. And in the finals, they gave Pittsburgh a pretty decent run until they didn't. But the Minnesota North Stars, 1991. Number 29, going with a recent Stanley Cup finalist here. The recent Stanley Cup finalists do tend to end up down here. There's reasons, though, and you'll see that. 2016 San Jose Sharks. So that is the only San Jose Sharks run to the Stanley Cup Finals. And again, going based on all the criteria I was using for this, they ended up being in 29th. And it was a good run. That was during the first year that this channel was a thing. So thanks, Sharks fans, for coming on board and getting mad at me when I hated the Sharks. I don't hate the Sharks now. But even though I do find myself occasionally cheering for the Sharks, I couldn't have them higher than 29th. This is a team that's been frustrating throughout their existence for being pretty good. In fact, while I was getting ready to do this video and doing up all these teams, I kept thinking, Shannon, you need to do like a power rankings of teams that have been high seeds or top ranked teams in the league and then blown it. And that's a power rankings that maybe Vancouver gets really high ranking on. Maybe it ends up being Boston that gets a high ranking on that, because certainly Boston's showing up on the board a lot today. Number 28, LA Kings in 1993. That, of course, was a run that Toronto fans are going to get mad about me mentioning, because that's how that works. But, they knock off Toronto, and then they lost in the finals against Montreal, which was one of those rare times where I was cheering for the Canadiens. I was cheering for the Canadiens because the Kings had denied me a Montreal-Toronto Stanley Cup Finals, which I thought would have been a lot of fun to watch. The Kings come in 28th. 27th, I have the most recent Stanley Cup finalists, the 2019 Boston Bruins. I know, Bruins fans are going to be mad at me. But of the 4 Bruins teams on this board, of the 4, I thought the 2019 run was the least impressive of the 4. And so, for that reason, I have them at 27th. Good overall run? Sure. I mean, they're ahead of a bunch of other teams, but do I put that as one of the greatest? No. And they blew it at home, which doesn't help. Number 26. I have the very unexpected 2018 run of the Vegas Golden Knights. Now, what Vegas and Boston could do to change the narrative on this board and mean that a couple years from now I have to completely redo this is, Whether or not a team has won a cup recently makes a difference to me, and whether or not they win a cup after makes a difference. So if Vegas actually does win a Stanley Cup, I'll say in the next 2 years, this 2018 finalist team, should a lot of those players still be on the Vegas roster, that would bump them up in my opinion. But when I was looking through it, I thought, okay, how many legit Hall of Famers can I see on the Vegas roster? Fleury. Outside of that, I don't see anybody that I would say is necessarily a Hall of Fame talent. Now with Boston, there was more than that. But with Boston, there were other factors too that had me drop them down to 27th. Again, I don't expect a lot of agreement on this. This was basically, an hour and a half of me setting it up. You guys know how long it's been since I did my last video. That whole time, I've been setting this up. 25th, I have the 1999 Buffalo Sabres. For me, the Buffalo Sabres run in 99 is as great as that is. It's the Hasek show. It is the Hasek show, and then in the finals against Belfour was right there with them. And while I agree that Buffalo may have deserved a better fate, that goal probably shouldn't have counted. If you read the 100 Things to Know and Do, or See and Do Before You Die as a Dallas or a Buffalo fan, the Buffalo and Dallas books surprisingly take completely different opinions on the 1999 disputed goal. You guys will be surprised by that. Next on the board is Boston again. So in 24th, we have Boston, and that's the 1988 roster. The 1988 team, pretty good in the overall standings, got to the finals, and it just didn't work because they were against the Oilers, and the Oilers were still a machine. So the 1988 iteration of the team, you got Neely, you've got pretty good goaltending. Ray Bourque on the blue line, he was pretty good. And so for me, I have them at 24th. But again, that's two Boston Bruins teams within 4 slots of one another. In 23rd, I have the second appearance, I should say, of the Flyers. And this is going to be the 1985 Flyers with Pelle Lindbergh. The 1985 Flyers, good team, very good during the regular season, get to the Stanley Cup Finals, and run into arguably the best team of all time, the 1985 Edmonton Oilers. So I have them at 23rd. Again, the Flyers get to the finals a lot. They don't win it, though. And so that's where, when I'm trying to come up with like the best of the finalists, you end up with Philadelphia being in the bottom half of the board. Number 22, Ottawa, the 2007 Ottawa Senators. The Senators were, oddly enough, seemingly trending down at the time they went on a run in 2007. They had a really good run. And then they ran into Anaheim in the finals, and Anaheim pushed them aside. At some point in time, I'm going to do a ranking as well of what I thought were the best Stanley Cup finals, because you make the internet angry once, you kind of get hooked on it. And so, the 2007 Ottawa Senators get in at 22nd. Next up on the board, knock knock, it's the Bruins. So Boston, and this is the 1990 Bruins, who won the President's Trophy. I was pretty sure as a Boston fan they were going to win the cup that year, and then again Edmonton just went, that's nice, off you go. It's nice. It's Boston again, huh? Out you go. No Stanley Cup for you. And that was it. And that was the year that they didn't have Gretzky either. I remember thinking before that finals, they don't have Gretzky. It's gonna happen. Nope, didn't happen. Next up, we're going to one of the more recent ones as well, and that's the 2012 New Jersey Devils. So New Jersey's on the board a couple of times. This is the first time they were on the board. The 2012 Devils. That was the run where they were trying to get Marty Berdeur's last Stanley Cup ring. They were trying to go for that 4th cup ring for him. And it just falls short against a Kings team that was pretty darn amazing. So New Jersey, 20th. Not too shabby. That's right about halfway. So what's at the halfway mark? Number 19 at the halfway mark, we have the New York Rangers from 2014. A team which had in 2012 been close to a President's Trophy. I had really wished they'd won it. I was very upset when the Canucks won that President's Trophy because I thought that's going to go to their heads. So 2014, The New York Rangers go all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals. That's as close as King Henrik gets to a Stanley Cup. And, it just doesn't, just so close. So close. So, we're into the top half now, because technically, 1938, so that's halfway. All right. Next up at number 18, the Anaheim Ducks, 2003. Jean-Sebastien Giguère. The Giguère-led Ducks, along with Paul Kariya and all of that bunch, pushed New Jersey as far as they could. That was the finals where the home team won every game. And the Ducks, they gave a pretty solid challenge to the New Jersey Devils that year. And so, Anaheim gets in it at 18th. 17th. Look who's back on the board. It's Philly. So when I was deciding which jersey to wear for this one, I was like, well, it's either got to be Philly or Boston, because they're both on the board 4 times. So I went with Boston. I wore Philly in a video yesterday, right? And I wore Philly in the live stream I did on the Entertainment Guy as well. So 1997, Philadelphia Flyers, that's the Legion of Doom. The Legion of Doom, for me, pushes them up to 17th. That's why I have them ahead of Anaheim, because I was thinking about that, and I thought, the Legion of Doom line, they got shut down in the finals, but, that was a really, really strong team, and so that's why Philly's where they are. And again, I admit, this is a far more subjective list, I would say, even than the Stanley Cup Champions one, because those are your winners, those are the ones who won the Stanley Cup, and you're looking at just measuring finalists, there's other factors that you're not necessarily going to worry about with Stanley Cup champions. Next on the board, number 16. I don't have to look at the date because I know which one this is. This is the 1994 Vancouver Canucks at 16th. The Canucks were a good team in 92 and 93. 94, much like Ottawa here, it felt like they were trending down and getting further away, and then they went all the way to the finals. And it was a very impressive run, and they beat 3 pretty good teams to get to the Stanley Cup Finals, with Calgary, Dallas, and Toronto. And so, it is tough to look at that run and see them as anything less than top half when it comes to finalists. And they pushed the Rangers to the absolute limit in the finals as well. So that works to their benefit. Number 15, just above them, is Calgary. Which Calgary Flames team is that? Well, that would be 2004. The 2004 team, yes, there's Flames fans who are still going to say, well, no, we were the champs. If not for that goal, we were the champs. Yeah, and if not for that goal, Buffalo, see, that's the thing. The Flames, I have them at 15th. They had a very good run. They beat some pretty darn good teams along the way to the finals that year. So, again, and that's part of it, too, is, so on their way to the finals, which teams did they go through? Which, again, is completely subjective. And so I have them, and there was more factors than that. But anyways, I always get people saying, show us your formula. Why? Then people are just going to get mad at the formula, too. Just get mad at the messenger. Just do that. Number 14, with 11 wins in a row in the playoffs, the 1992 Chicago Blackhawks. They were impressive. And then in the finals, they were done. And they had Hasek and Belfort. And I'm thinking of all of the teams on this board, they might be the only team that had 2 Hall of Fame goaltenders in net. And yet, Pittsburgh took them apart in the second half of their back-to-backs in 91 and 92. So you have the 91 team down here, 92 team here. There you go. Number 13. And this is where we get into a team that had won the Stanley Cup recently and would win it again. And that's the Montreal Canadiens of 1989. So Montreal I have at 13th. I ranked them ahead of Chicago because, again, they won the Cup in 86. They would win it again in 93. Patrick Roy, of course, huge part of both of those Cup wins. And the 89 team was very good during the regular season. They had a very good run to get to the Stanley Cup Finals. And, again, if not for a couple of bounces here and there one way or the other, they could very well have knocked off Calgary. But it didn't happen. And so they find themselves on this board at 13th. At 12th, an excellent run for the Philadelphia Flyers. This is the 4th and final time we're going to talk about the Flyers. A dynasty of Stanley Cup finalists. Does that help? No? Okay. That really doesn't help. I can say as a Canuck fan, Bruins fan, it doesn't help. The Bruins are going to beat the Blues because, look, the Blues can't win. And I'm like, hey, the Bruins suck in the finals. And they're like, you know what you're talking about. You're not a real Bruins fan. Yeah. So, 1987... That's the Ron Hextall year. Hextall had an amazing run, and they pushed a very talented Edmonton Oilers team to as close as you're going to get to knocking them off with that squad. So Philadelphia, full marks to them for that one, and so they show up at 12th. We're into the pretty darn good Stanley Cup finalists here. Number 11, the only time they show up on the board is Tampa. Now, what's funny with Tampa is that's 2015. They knocked off teams, I think it was number 1 and number 3 overall in that Stanley Cup Finals run. And they gave Chicago a very, very good Stanley Cup Finals push. And that was one of the most entertaining Stanley Cup Finals I ever watched, was the 2015 Finals. That was absolutely great. Tampa Bay played really, really well, and now it's 5 years later, and everybody talks about, they can't win, they choke in the playoffs. That was only 5 years ago, and a lot of those same players are still with the Tampa Bay organization. So don't write them off just yet, because Detroit will tell you that's when they'll get you. Number 10. Calgary's on the board again. And this is the 1986 run. This was a team that was pretty close. Now, the Steve Smith goal helped them get beyond Edmonton. But Calgary was really, really close to being a champion in 86. They lose to Montreal, who, of course, are right here as 13th. Montreal, Calgary, those were a couple of very entertaining finals as well, the 86 and the 89. And that Flames team was very, very good in 86. And the lessons learned there would come back so they could win in 89. So, again, a future champion puts them in the top 10. Number 9. And this is the one I always hear a lot about. The Vancouver Canucks in 2011 are the best team not to win a Stanley Cup. I have them at 9th on Stanley Cup finalists. Not first. And I know when I talked about doing Stanley Cup finalist rankings, I had people saying, oh, well, that's a way to make Vancouver number 1 then. No. Not over every year from 1981 until now. For the 2010s, maybe. No, actually not for the 2010s even. So 2011, of course, they win the President's Trophy. They choked in games 6 and 7. And what happened? You look at those games, you look at the scores, and it's not like Boston struggled or had to beat them in overtime. The Vancouver Canucks just folded. And so I have them at 9th. It was an impressive run along the way, but I can't have them higher than 9th. Number 8, Boston shows up for the final time, and that's the 2013 team. Team that had won the Cup 2 years earlier. And I was really, really entertained by the Stanley Cup Finals in 2013 between Boston and Chicago. Yeah, Chicago beat them, but it was a very entertaining finals. So I thought it was good, and it showed that Boston was just that close. Just that close. So here they are, the 2013 team, the 2019 team, 1990, 1988. And people will say, well, Boston's an elite organization. Yeah, they've won one of their last 5 trips in the time I've been watching hockey to the Stanley Cup Finals. If you go back into the 70s, there's more Stanley Cup Finals they've lost in the 70s as well. So, yeah, when they get to the finals, it's great. But what happens there is often not great. So, just as a heads up for this summer, should they reach the Stanley Cup Finals again, don't be surprised if I'm going, you know what, I can't pick them. I just can't. Next on the board, Dallas. So the 7th spot goes to Dallas, and that's the 2000 team. The 2000 team gets that spot. They were going for back-to-back Stanley Cups. They lost to the New Jersey Devils. It was a very tightly checked series, and it was a pretty good battle between those two teams. And yeah, Dallas comes up just shy of repeating as Stanley Cup champs, which to this day does, on some level, yeah, it bothers me a little bit because they were one and done. And I don't like seeing a team that's one and done, because then you can kind of push them aside and we'll go, well, yeah, they won that cup, but. So, next on the board, ahead of them, at 6th, the 2009 Detroit Red Wings. They'd won the cup in 2008. They were going for their back-to-back Stanley Cup, and their finals matchup was great as well, against the same team they beat in 2008. So, in all honesty, this was the easiest one for me when it came to figuring out which one's which. I thought the Pittsburgh roster was more impressive in 08 than the Detroit roster in 09. And the Penguins were on their way up. Detroit was on their way down after 09. So for me, it was, I would put Pittsburgh ahead of Detroit. Both of them had very good runs along the way. Detroit, a lot of Stanley Cups for them over the years. And, losing in that final, there's no shame in losing. And, of course, Marian Hossa may have played a role on both of those teams. Just throwing that out there. Number 4. New Jersey had a chance to go back-to-back, and they didn't. And that was in 2001. And so I have the New Jersey Devils in 2001 as the number 4 team on this board. Very, very good team. Very well played. Of course, they won the Cup in 2000. They won it in 2003. So because of that, I thought, I have to have them at least this high on the board because they would win it again 2 years later, and they had won it the year before. And it's one of those rarities when you're looking at this board of teams that had won it a couple years before and then a little bit after. It's very rare to see that on the board. I'm trying to think if... Let me think. I mean, Montreal kind of, 86 and 93 kind of, but that's still a longer period than for New Jersey. And of course, if New Jersey had won that, that would have been 4 cup rings for Brodeur. Number 3, Detroit. So Detroit finally reached the Stanley Cup final in 1995 and then got pushed aside, and that led to more Detroit dead things jokes. They would get their revenge later. Of course, and it is interesting that they get to the Stanley Cup finals before they start winning. They lose in the Stanley Cup finals and then they're done. So it is weird that they lost to Stanley Cup finals before their modern day dynasty. They lost to Stanley Cup finals at the end of it and haven't been back since, and they weren't in the Stanley Cup finals before that. So it's bookended by a couple of Stanley Cup finals losses. Number 2 and number 1. Number 2, the Edmonton Oilers, 1983. Now, this is where I couldn't have just said, okay, well, they got swept in the finals by the Islanders, so I'm going to put them all the way down below other teams because that finals didn't go to 7. They had a team that was arguably one of the best in history in 1983. The 80s Oilers were crazy good, and part of the reason why you're going to see Stanley Cup finalists now lower on the board than the ones from a long time ago, you can't put these rosters together anymore. In the pre-salary cap era, and yeah, people are going to say, well, then you should have just graded them differently. No, I wanted to do it this way. It's kind of fun. So the pre-salary cap era, you could put together these Oilers and for pretty cheap keep them all together. And then, of course, that would change. Paul Coffey went, can I have money? And they went, you're traded. And then at some point, Pocklington went, is Gretzky worth money? And the Kings went, yes. And so he got sold. And then other players were like, can we have money? And then they were just gone. So before all of that happened in 1983, they lost a pretty fun to watch Stanley Cup Finals against the Islanders, who then lost the Stanley Cup Finals in 1984. And the Oilers learned a lot of lessons in that 83 finals that they took into the 84 finals and pushed aside the New York Islanders. But the Islanders have to be first. They won 19 series in a row. 19. Yes, Edmonton took them aside, and that finals was clearly the coronation of Wayne Gretzky as the best player in league, you would argue, history now. But again, that's arguable, and we can have that discussion later. But that coronation, what gets lost in that is that it was 19 series in a row for the Islanders. So that's basically an extra season of hockey they had played in playoffs during that 5-year stretch. And it took a large toll on those players. They wouldn't be back, but they had won 4 in a row and they were going for 5. So to me, the New York Islanders in 84 have to be number 1 on this list. But let me know your thoughts in the comments section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. And there you go. There you got it. There you got it. There you go. See, that's the light in my room on the Rangers. But there you go. The power rankings of all the Stanley Cup finalists from the Vancouver Canucks in 82 to the New York Islanders in 84. Thank you guys so much for watching, as always. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're just browsing your way through. The channel's very, very close to 141,000. And I wanted to do this today because I thought, yeah, sure, we'll do a power rankings on a Monday because why not?